Ray. What do you want to do tonight?
Same thing we do every night, Pinky. Try to take over the world.
When I was working in the corporations as a scientist and as an engineer in the 1970s, there was a feeling at that time that for some reason science must be separate from spirituality, that we must choose to either follow the path of hard science or the path of spirituality, but never the two could come together. And the problem that created among my colleagues is that they felt excluded. They were left out of a very important conversation. And it's the conversation about us. Who are we? Where do we come from? What is our relationship to one another, to ourselves, to the earth, to the world around us? And it's important for this reason. For over 5,000 years, our most cherished spiritual traditions, not religious, but spiritual traditions, have given us answers. They're not scientific answers, however, they are accurate answers, as science is now proving about who we are and where we come from and our relationship to the world. Because they did not use the language of science, those who follow only science tend to discount this information. So as I would have this conversation with my colleagues, and I would say, here's a 3,000-year-old text that gives us the answers you are asking me, and they'd say, but it's not scientific. What I found was that there was a missing bridge between the language of our ancestors and our most cherished spiritual traditions and the best science of today. And if I could somehow find a way for my friends and my colleagues to bridge those two worlds, then we could all begin to explore this journey, the same conversation together. Excuse me, the conversation that helps us to answer the deepest questions of our existence so that we can apply what we learn to solve the biggest problems of the world right now. So that was my path. In the early 1970s, I began exploring the relationship between the human body, as our ancestors have always described, and what the best science of our time was telling us at a very fundamental level as an engineer. The human body is electrical and magnetic in nature. And what we know is that every organ in our body creates an electrical field and a magnetic field. This is the stuff that connects our world. The best science of our time is now telling us that when we create emotions in our hearts, that those emotions actually regulate the electrical and the magnetic field throughout the rest of the body. So we are given a process as biological beings that mimics what the engineers are building in the machines around them. Once my colleagues began to understand this, they said, we're talking the same language, but we're coming from very different places. And I said, yes, so how far can we take this? And what they began to understand is that every cell is essentially an electrical circuit. And it has capacitance, it has resistance, it transmits energy, it receives energy, just the way the components on a surface-mounted board did as the engineers were building. And they were amazed. They said, we've never thought of ourselves in this way. What is the key that drives this biological device that we call our bodies? What is the key? Well, this is interesting because when I was in school back in the 60s, 70s, most of our listeners, we were in school, we were taught that the brain is the master organ in the body. And the brain is important. And it's from the brain that the rest of our body receives the signals that tells our body how to function. The chemistry of our body is regulated through the signals in the brain. However, what the best science of our time only now is beginning to understand parallels what our most ancient and cherished traditions have always told us. That the brain regulates the signals, but the brain can only do so when it receives the signal itself from the heart. And this is where the new frontier, what I believe is perhaps the greatest frontier of the new science, this is where it's beginning. Because what we're now beginning to understand is that every moment of every day, we create a signal from our heart, and the quality of that signal from our heart to our brain regulates the way the rest of our body functions. So when we feel the feelings of well-being and peace, for example, that is one kind of signal, and tells our brain that we live in a safe world, and our brain doesn't have to worry about fight or flight or defense. So our brain is able in that time to release the chemistry that supports life and the strong immune system and growth. When we feel a sense of fear and that we're threatened, the brain shuts down that part of our experience for a high immune system and high immune response, and it goes into what is called fight or flight with the chemistry, high levels of cortisol and adrenaline for the fight or flight. It's all about the way we feel in our hearts. Now, this is really interesting to me because when we study those ancient traditions, what we begin to understand is the reason this connection is not acknowledged in the modern world is because the very texts that tell us about the power of the human heart are the texts that were either edited or deleted from our most cherished traditions. And now that they're being rediscovered, we now know how this relationship works, and science is bearing it out. So the power of the human heart is almost universal in the indigenous traditions, the oral traditions, the written traditions. It's the core of the texts when we study the ancient Egyptians, for example, and throughout Mesoamerica. And now our own science is beginning to bear this out, that the heart is really where the action is when it comes to regulating our bodies. And there's a new coin now that has been termed, and the term is heart intelligence. What science has determined, and this is the scientific fact, is that there actually is a neural network, brain-like cells in the heart itself. The neural network in our hearts works precisely the way the one in our brain does. It has a memory. It preserves a memory from a lifetime. It is actually an opportunity for us to think about our world, to feel our world, and make decisions and considerations about our world, not based on this neural network, but on this neural network, on the intelligence of the heart. We know this typically, instinctively, intuitively, is what we call a gut feeling. Now science is beginning to bear out precisely how this relationship works. One of the first ways that scientists began to understand that the heart has a memory, and this is very interesting to me, was there was a successful heart transplant from a young child into the body of a woman who was in her 80s. The operation was successful. The woman woke up. The doctor said, "How do you feel?" She says, "I feel good and I'm hungry." He says, "Okay, we'll get you some food." And she goes, "Well, I want not the hospital food." And she began to give very specific kinds of foods that she was craving as she was awakening from the anesthesia. She'd never eaten these foods before in her life. And a little investigation showed that the 13-year-old boy whose heart she had received, what she was craving were the foods that were his favorite foods. They said, okay, maybe it's a coincidence, anecdotally. This led to a series of studies, and they found that this happens actually very frequently, that when an organ is and specifically a heart, is transplanted into the body of a recipient, the recipient will begin to take on characteristics such as food cravings of the person that the heart originally, the heart originally resided in. This went so far, and this is why authorities now are so certain that this memory actually happens. There was a young woman who was murdered, and her heart was not injured in the murder, and it was transplanted into the body of another woman who immediately began having nightmares. The same nightmare, night after night, again and again, very detailed, very specific, very precise about the murder that had actually taken her life. The authorities began to take this seriously into consideration, and they researched the details, and the details were so specific they led to the arrest and the conviction of the person who committed the murder. And when we see that kind of information, it begins to take it out of the realm of anecdote and into the realm of telling us there's a phenomenon that's happening here that we haven't acknowledged in the past. There is a neural network, a brain within the heart. The brain has memory. It goes much more than that. The brain bypasses the logic of the mind. And in this way, it serves us because it can help us make decisions based on what we feel as truth rather than what we judge or discern even. What our bias, our fear may prevent us from seeing when we think about the choices. Our heart doesn't see any of that because it makes its decisions based upon what it's feeling here, not what we're thinking from our past experience. So the term that now is being coined is called heart intelligence. And it's through this heart intelligence that we're beginning to open a new door of possibility about how this can serve us in our lives in the new world that's emerging, where we find ourselves interconnected with one another and with all life in ways that we're only beginning to understand.